You'll see this in Matthew's gospel. The finger is pointed a little more just like right at Judas. In the other gospels, you'll notice that's not the case. It's left much more broad. And what I would tell you is understanding the way they kind of put this all in context, right? What appears to happen here is Jesus does not necessarily point right at Judas out in the open like that. I mean, that probably would have made them be like, well, hey, let's get that guy out of here, right? I mean, why is he still here? Run him out of here, right? So I doubt that's the way that happened. And remember what I told you earlier about how the different plates and the bowls of things would pass around the table. So at this point, everyone has likely already dipped or will dip into that bowl with Jesus, okay? So it's a little bit, that's why there's a bit of vagueness here. Now hang with me because you're about to read this and like, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about, but I'll explain it. Verse 24, the Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But woe to the man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born. Now, obviously, we know Jesus here is talking about Judas. Verse 25. Then Judas, the one who would betray him, remember Matthew is writing this down many years later, said, surely not I, Rabbi. Now, I want you to notice the difference of the verbiage here, firstly. When Judas addresses Jesus here, do you notice anything different about that than from the conclusion of verse 22 and the way all the other disciples speak to Jesus? There's a difference in the verbiage, and it's critical. He calls him rabbi, Judas calls him rabbi, and everyone else calls him Lord. And in Matthew's gospel, what you will find is that those who place their faith sincerely in Christ, they reference him as Lord. Judas doesn't do that here. To him, he uses just the word teacher. Rabbi just means teacher. Now, we can't know for sure how significant that necessarily was, but it is certain that Matthew records that piece of things on purpose. Jesus answered, yes, it is you. And you're like, well, wait a minute. I thought that wasn't so obvious. My guess is that was said a little more discreetly to Judas. Again, I wasn't there. I don't know. But that's my guess, just putting everything in context with what we understand from the other Gospels and the telling of this story. And so said discreetly, remembered later by one of the disciples, pointed out in Matthew's recounting of it, is likely what happens here. Either way, we know it's Judas. We know he's the one that breaks this fellowship. So look at verse 26. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, take and eat. This is my body. Then he took the cup, gave thanks, and offered it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. We're going to talk about covenant here in just a minute. I tell you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom. And we're going to get to that at the very end of the message this morning. When they had sung a hymn, he went out to the Mount of Olives. They went out to the Mount of Olives. To fully understand what's happening at this table, what's happening with Jesus, we got to go back. We got to go back even further. I've already asked you to go back 2,000 years. Let's go back further than that. Let's add another 1,000 or so. And let's go back to that time of the Passover. Because this meal is called the Passover meal. They're seated around the Passover table purposefully to remember. And this remembering is really critical. That's our first point. The Passover was a reminder of God's deliverance. So the fact that Jesus has this table set and is making this message and this lesson about what he is about to do, and he's making that lesson and that message at the Passover table, y'all, it has so much meaning and you cannot miss it. The Passover, as most of you know, was a pivotal event in Israel's history. It was that time where on the 10th and final plague, right, God has said to Pharaoh, let my people go. Remember, the Israelites are slaves in Egypt, and Pharaoh will not listen to God, even though he sends all kinds of terrible calamities on them, and he won't listen. Finally, the 10th and final plague is the firstborn children will die. And the only thing that saves as that spirit, or that angel of death, passes over that region, The only thing that will save the people of God's children is if they have painted the blood of the sacrificial lamb on their door. And just like it sounds, that angel of death passes over those homes that are covered by the blood. So the fact that we're seated at the Passover table here, as you can see, has incredible meaning. And so when you and I gather on a Sunday morning and we partake together in communion, we are remembering that Jesus' blood covers us. We are reminded that sin and death has passed over us because of the blood of Christ covering us. This is good news. And as we gather, we should be thinking of and be praising God for his faithfulness in making a way for us where there was no way. This is what Jesus did for you and me. We should remember that we, just like the Israelites, were once slaves. When we gather every Sunday, we should remember we were in their predicament. We needed to be set free. We were not slaves to Pharaoh. We were slaves to sin and death. And Jesus loved us enough that even while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Man, it's unbelievable good news. And so we remember when we gather his faithfulness. We remember what he's done. And we should be thankful. Some of you who grew up in the high church, you know that communion time as being called the Eucharist. And the Eucharist is really just terminology that comes for the description of what happens here as Jesus breaks the bread and shares the cup. It says he gives thanks. And the Eucharist really literally just means to give thanks. So when we come together on a Sunday morning, we should give thanks to Jesus, to God in heaven, for his faithfulness in saving us and having sin and death pass over us because we are covered by the blood of Christ. Secondly, what we see happening in here is Jesus proving out for us, proving out to his disciples that he will now fulfill the Passover. He is the new and final fulfillment of the Passover itself. Matthew 26:28 says, "This is my blood of the covenant." Notice that language. My blood is now the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Now salvation has come to all who would receive it. So it's the old covenant versus the new covenant. In the old covenant, in the Old Testament, the Passover lamb's blood saved the Israelites from physical death, but now Jesus offers himself as the ultimate Passover lamb. And his blood is saving us from spiritual death. And he himself, y'all, you may not have ever caught this, he himself becomes the firstborn son that dies. But he dies for the sin of the world. Again, an unbelievable gift. Jesus here is teaching us that he will fulfill the law. The bread and the cup in this passage represent really something entirely new.